welcome everyone to Reshaping the Future of OKRs. My name is Cansel.
And I'm Natalija.
And we are going to talk about the 10 current OKR trends and their impact actually in OKR organizations. I'm an independent OKR coach and strategy coach, and I've been working in digital product management for over 14 years now. I've been guiding Agile transformations in organizational development. And when I was building up portfolio management, I came across OKRs. And since then, I have had the chance to guide quite a few organizations in their OKR implementations. And in this video today, I want to share some of those experiences and the trends I'm observing.
And I work as an organizational development coach, as an OKR expert. And I think my main motivation is really to improve organizational effectiveness and create a system that kind of helps people to really transform strategy into action. So I focus on leadership and responsibility, strategy execution, but also Agile, HR, and learning, because I've got a background in HR, in transformation management, and also in leadership development. And I came across OKRs many years ago and found that they are maybe even the missing piece when it comes to organizational development and strategy execution. So today I focus on implementing OKRs, coaching and educating people on their OKR journeys, but also very conscious OKR system designs or how OKR relates to other organizational parts. And therefore, I founded OKRs at the Center a couple of years ago to create a collaborative platform, because topics like OKRs, they constantly evolve and there's so much to learn about how to get most of the value out of working with them. And this is what we want to do today, right? Share our experiences and then hopefully give you some practical tips on how to even get more out of working with OKRs. But let's start at the beginning, right? Goals are a very essential part of every organizational system. There are many different frameworks around for quite a while on how to deal with goals in organizations. And in the 70s, there was this new kid on the block, right? The OKR framework was born and was first tried out in companies like Intel, for example. It later made its move to Google and the Silicon Valley and became quite famous in the recent years. So we've seen kind of an OKR evolution already, from the first adaptations to new iterations and perspectives. And the question that we would like to at least start to answer today is, where do we see OKRs today? Like, what is the status quo of OKRs? What kind of trends do we currently observe? And what do these trends then also mean for the future of OKRs? When we talk about OKRs, we mean the quite simple idea that in every organization, you have a certain degree of long-term goals, right? You might have a purpose, a mission statement, a vision, or a strategy or strategic focus topics on the one side. And then on the other side, you have the daily execution. So the decisions and the daily tasks that you need to do in order to hopefully get closer towards your long-term vision. And this is where OKRs come in. Their goal is really to bridge the gap between the long-term goals and the daily task to, on a daily basis, on a quarterly, on a yearly basis, help you to move closer towards your future vision. And they do that by combining two things. They combine an inspiring description of the next step towards your purpose and vision in an objective with measurable key results that look at the objective from different perspectives and measure a change in a relative or absolute value. But OKRs are not just a framework that kind of have a different style of defining goals, but they're essentially a concept that make it possible to work differently with goals. And this is where the iterative OKR cycle comes in. You start with the OKR definition. You then move into a process of regularly tracking your progress in the OKR check-ins. And then at the end of the cycle, which typically lasts 3 or 4 months, you reflect back, learn and adjust, and take all the insights from the last journey into the next OKR definition, and then again start to answer the question, with what we have learned so far, with where we want to be in the future, what is then now the next valuable step that we need to undertake in our organization? And building on that initial idea of OKRs, what we want to share with you today are, what are the latest trends around OKRs that we see in organizations and in the community? what is then their impact, and do we see that as maybe a positive or maybe even a negative trend from our observation? And we want to spice it up with some practical examples and tips to give you something that is hopefully directly applicable in your context to help you to get more out of working with OKRs. And we're going to start with one very important but also interesting topic, which is the trend that we're moving from an output to an outcome-based view of OKRs. Right, Cansel?
Exactly. Thanks, Natalija. Luckily, this is a positive trend I'm observing here in the OKR universe. Thanks to many international experts like Christina Wodke, Jeff Gotthelf, Joshua Seiden with his perfect book Outcomes over Output. What do we mean with that? Originally, when OKR started in the 70s, but even in the 90s, when Google started adapting OKRs, the original question which was asked is, what will we do to achieve our objectives? This framing of the question drove us rather think in milestones and projects. And we started now reframing the question in direction, how will we know that we are achieving our objectives, right? And along this reframing, this small difference in questioning helped us to find rather outcome-oriented key results. Let me give you an example. When I start writing a blog post, the activity of writing something, maybe 4 times a month, is something that I create. And it still doesn't tell me if I create an impact with that, right? It's just stating the activity I did. And this, what we name, is the pure output, actually. Now, in the outcome-focused OKRs, we are rather asking the question, what is the impact I want to create with my blog post? How will I know that my blog post is effective? And I can only measure the effectiveness of my blog post with, for example, views. And I say my blog post generate 1,000 views per month. This can be something showing me that people react to my blog post. They see it, they read it, they share it, they like it, right? So people actually like what I write. And this is how I see the resonance of the people of my target group I'm writing for, how they react to it and how they consume it. And their behavior, how they react to the output I created, is the actual outcome we are naming in OKRs. And we are aiming, of course, all the time to write down rather outcome-oriented OKRs instead of output-oriented OKRs to create effectiveness. A practical tip here to move from output to outcome OKRs is, for example, asking the question, how would you define the success of your output? What's your expectation from your output? How will you know that your output is successful at the end, right? With these questions, you can find out what are your expectations and then write down your outcomes accordingly. Now, writing OKRs in outcome-focused space is one huge step indeed to create effective OKRs, but it's not the only one. Imagine we have great teams, specialized, and they are experts in writing outcome-focused OKRs, but we don't have a strategy. This is a huge problem I see, unfortunately a negative trend, because somehow we believe, organizations believe, when they start implementing OKRs, every other problem will be solved. But what I see is that if the strategy part is missing, then OKRs are not really flourishing as they should be. Now, what I mean with that, let's have a look in the organizational layers we have. Most of the times what we see is we have a purpose. Why do we do what we do? We have a vision, the future we want to create, and then we jump into our projects, right? We create our projects, our features. We know what we are going to work on. This is our output part. Now, we know that output is not enough, and therefore we start with the OKR implementations and decide what are we going to focus on in the next 3 to 4 months. Now imagine how huge the gap is between the initiative OKRs and the vision and the purpose. You see that there's the vision is rather for endless time, or maybe for 3 to 5 years even, let's say, and OKR is a time period of 3 to 4 months. So we need to fill that gap with kind of a direction, and this direction is given with a solid strategy, with a clear strategy. Where do we play? How do we win? And what do we focus on in the next 12 to 18 months to create a competitive advantage, right? And this strategy is the missing part most of the times. So before we start OKRs, we need to have a look into our strategy to make sure that we know in which direction we are going to go. What are our big bets actually? When I talk about this with the organizations, then they tell me, yeah, Cansel, don't worry, we have our strategy in place. And they show me their roadmaps, for example, which is nothing else than a future or project roadmap. This is not a strategy. This is just telling us what are we going to create, what is the output we want to create, right? So this is still not enough. It's not telling us in which direction we are going to move forward to. Then they tell me we have also the KPI dashboards. We know how much money we want to make. We know how much profit we want to make. We know what the market share should be next year. Okay, that's fine. That's nice to have these ambitions, to have these wishes. But tell me the way to get there. Tell me how you intend to get it to double your revenues, for example, or create a new market. The other thing that I see quite often is the strategic pillars, right? These are nothing else than any evergreen statements where they show us we want to have an excellent customer service. We want to have excellent operational effectiveness and these kind of things I see in these slides. And to be honest, I could exchange the logos of the companies, and most of the people wouldn't recognize that it's not their strategy page. So this is not the strategy, but what is a strategy actually? I'm quite inspired by Roger L. Martin, Simon Wardley, and Richard Rumelt, of course. And if I combine all what they're saying is in one sentence, is that strategy is a coherent and actionable set of choices of where to play and how to be in a foreseeable future. How do we get there? How do we create that? Now, we said we need to know about where do we play and how do we win, right? So we need to start with these strategic insights. What's our market? What's our customer segments? What are the market problems, or what are the opportunities out there? And what about our capabilities? What do we need there, right? So have a clear picture of all these elements, of all these information is the first step to a good strategy. Then, under given circumstances, under given opportunities and problems you're observing in the market, now it's time to choose your focus, your strategic focus, to sharpen your value proposition, to think about what kind of outcomes, what kind of change of behavior in the target group do we want to see that will create an advantage to us, to competitive advantage for us. Now, once you decided on your, let's say for the midterm, for 12 or 18 months, your strategic focus, then you can start creating your OKRs. Every team can now decide how they can contribute to that strategy, to that strategic focus. And then we can go into our initiatives to create our action plans. And all this together at the end, of course, should have a positive impact for our business, meaning our business APIs, KPIs. This business impact comes here in play, that we can see, okay, everything what we do we see any positive progress in our KPIs now? This all together, outcome-oriented OKRs and a clear directional strategy are the main starting points, let's say, for a healthy OKR organization. Now, after this, once we have these, then we can think about what is the next step. How do we do that? How do we implement it in our organization? And this is what Natalija is going to talk about now.
Yes, so now we have decided we have OKRs, we recheck that we have a good directional strategy, and then we just use OKRs, cascade them down, and even better, use the key results as objectives for the next level, right? So we basically take our long-term goals, we create something on a company level that kind of resembles objectives and key results, and then we basically push that down to our departments and our teams kind of on the top-down cascading level, right? No, that's not the idea behind OKRs. That's unfortunately what we both experience in a lot of organizations that have been working with OKRs, and that then maybe come to us saying that we don't really get enough value out of OKRs. Can you maybe have a look and assess our situation? And this is one of the first things I'm always looking for. Like, how does the OKR system work and how do they align their OKRs? And did they maybe fall into the trap of just cascading down OKRs and basically doing what they have always done with their goal frameworks, just calling them now objectives and key results? So if this is not the idea, what is then the idea? Let's look back at the basic principles of OKRs, right? The idea is to work with goals in short cycles from the perspective of continuous improvement, rein with transparency, and combine the inspirational objective with measurable key results. But there are two more. One is you want to make it a participatory process, right? Because we come from the belief that we don't have the single answers on the different layers in the organization, but that we rather need a combination of a top-down and a bottom-up approach to make the best decisions and set the best directions for our goals. And of course, we want to make sure that people have an orientation, but orientation doesn't mean that we need to just cascade down goals, but it rather means that we actually need to align our different perspectives into a shared picture. So what that means is when we talk about OKR alignment, we're talking about horizontal and vertical alignment. So we come from the long-term goals, from the directional strategy that Cansel was talking about, or maybe even a midterm view of, for example, 12 months. And then we think about what are then the different goals, the different next steps and forms of OKRs that we need to undertake to actually make that happen. And then align these goals horizontally and vertically. There can be team OKRs, there can be department OKRs, there can be something else. We got to that in a second. But we want to make sure that all these puzzle pieces together contribute enough to make sure that we have then a chance to reach our midterm and strategic goals. So we don't want to just push it down, but we want to create a top-down and bottom-up approach together to align on a shared system where we can increase the likelihood of actually achieving our midterm goals. But speaking of OKR sets, there's a lot of diversity out there if you want to make it work, right?
Yes, exactly. So we need to mix it up. We need to understand that the midterm strategic focus is actually the binding element here. Once we have this, then, as Natalija said, we are not bind to any cascading systems. What kind of teams can we have? What kind of OKR teams can we create here? Let's talk about this. We might have a product-driven organization that we create product OKRs in the first level, and then of course for if the product is big enough, then we have sub-product teams or even enabler teams, maybe not working directly in the product but enabling the product, like infrastructure teams, right? So these teams could have, I'm saying, their own OKR set aligned with the product OKR, right? So let's leave it optional if each team should have their own OKR, or maybe is it enough to have the product OKR defined for everyone working in that area. Now, we could have also a department OKR like marketing. Marketing could have their own OKR set contributing to the midterm strategy, but also aligned with product teams to create a shared goal, how they can move forward, right? And let's talk about that shared goal in a second. When we have already dedicated teams, legal, web development, sales, and so on, all these teams can come together and define their goals, how they want to work on that, how they want to collaborate on that goal to achieve it all together. So it is not necessary that each team writes their own OKRs. In that case, we can create a shared OKR altogether. On the other hand, we might have a topic for which we don't have a dedicated team yet. So we might have strategic themes we want to pursue, new opportunities we want to open up. Maybe we need some mixed teams, flexible teams, dynamic teams, changing, working with OKRs towards these strategic themes, and these teams can dynamically decide from phase to phase, from OKR cycle to the next one, how they want to move forward with that topic. Maybe even this topic will become a dedicated team with the time. Once the OKR work shows that it's a valid point, it's a good bet to work on that, right? So we have a mix of many team types, and then according how the team work or how the teams collaborate with each other, then we can decide what kind of an OKR setup we need here. Now, the team alone is a huge important part in the whole OKR process, and this team also needs a separate attention how they develop themselves, and Natalija is going to talk about this part now.
Exactly, because what we often see happening is that organizations look into OKRs, think it's a great fit towards their problem, implement that, and then think that magically all their problems will move away. This is, of course, not the case, as you've probably already experienced yourself. And I think one major reason is that by implementing a framework, you don't necessarily start to actually develop your individuals, your teams, and your organization. So this is the special attention that Cansel was just mentioning. When organizations set out to work with OKRs, they're often looking for better focus, more alignment, maybe even create more autonomy in the teams, or want to move into faster learning cycles, a better show of how the meaningful contribution of everyone kind of sums up in the long-term goals, or they maybe want to focus more on value creation. This is, for example, where outcome OKRs then come in. What they sometimes, I think, overlook is that OKRs is not a simple cure to just get there immediately, right? OKRs is rather a means to an end and one piece of the entire puzzle in your organizational system. So what you need to keep in mind when it comes to the development is that OKRs or goals in general are a central part of your organizational system, but there's a lot of other things already out there and already in place, right? We've talked about the long-term goals and the executional part, but you also have values and norms in place. You have certain structures and processes. You have a certain way to collaborate. You have a way on how leadership deals with things, how people take over responsibility, and, for example, a lot of different HR processes that might also have a connection. The benefit I see in OKR, and I think the great chance, is that if you start working differently with goals, that can serve as a catalyst for the entire organizational development. Because as soon as you start doing something differently with your goals, it will kind of create a momentum for the rest of the organization. And so it can support you in your endeavor to then create more focus, autonomy, and all these other things as well. But that's why I just said support. It will not be kind of the only pill you need to swallow and then these things magically appear, but it's one piece of the puzzle that you need to keep in mind with very distinct interconnections with the other organizational systems. And speaking of connections, it's not just the connections from the goals to the other things, but there's an interdependence in the organizational system. So that means that everything that is already in place in your organization before you start working with OKRs will have a major impact on how successful you can actually implement and work with OKRs. So let's look at an example. A typical example that I often encounter in organization is, well, we started to work with OKRs, but it takes way too much time. And then I'm always like, okay, let's look at how you actually work with OKRs, and maybe we can identify a pattern here or a reason why it's not working like that. So often what I see is that knowledge and experience around OKRs is there, but the organization might still work in a very siloed ways. Right? For example, coming back to the OKR architecture, there are only departmental goals that are then roughly aligned, but there's no really shared experiences on what we're trying to work on. Often there's also a lack of communication between these different silos of the organization. And often it's also a question of, okay, how well do people take on self-responsibility? Do they have a system and a context where they can actually do that easily? So it's often not so much about what the challenge is within the framework, but what is the challenge then in your organizational system that might lead to, for example, OKR alignments taken forever, because you need to align all the different departments who don't really collaborate with each other. So this is, I think, something that we really need to keep in mind when we work with OKRs, is what kind of context do we currently have? And how do we need to not just develop the way that we work with goals, but develop the things around our goals to actually make it work together as an entire system? And so what we need to increase the likelihood of success for the OKR implementation is to look at three things when it comes to development. First, the individual one. So here we're talking about individual coaching or training. For example, if you think about leaders and how their roles and also their expected behaviors change as soon as you start working with OKR. We're looking at team development. So, for example, actively creating an environment where the team can thrive with OKR, where it makes sense for them to work with OKRs, and where it's also clear for them how that relates to their current challenges and how OKRs can support them in their endeavors. And last but not least, we're talking about organizational development. So really designing the connections I just talked about to the other organizational elements and make sure that the organizational system as a whole can actually be successful. That does not mean necessarily, if we keep all that in mind, that it actually works in practice and on an everyday basis, right?
Yes, the teams have many different frameworks in place, and this is okay that every team chooses their own way of working. This is totally natural, right? The point is, when we start having many different frameworks in an organization, we should be aware of that. We should be aware of why do we use this framework, for which purpose. All of them have their fulfill some needs, but we need to be aware of not to overwhelm the system. And first of all, not to have all these frameworks in their individual areas in a parallel universe without connecting them with each other, right? So the point here is definitely embrace different frameworks, different ways of working, but embed the systems with each other, combine them. For example, OKR and Scrum, OKR and design thinking. Be aware of what is Scrum good for and how can OKR complement Scrum process, for example, the Scrum framework. So this is quite a critical point. Otherwise, the teams get overwhelmed because they have 3 different frameworks to work on, and they need to follow all the meetings and events that each framework dictate to them to follow up on. This is why I always say combine the frameworks, have as a lean process as possible, right? So how do we combine them? This is another a magical topic, of course. What I see is that we tend to rename the existing elements we already have in the system. Like suddenly a project is not called project, but it's called objective. That's wrong, obviously. This has nothing to do with project management in that case. Or an epic is not an objective. A feature is not an objective. Like a task or user story is not a key result. So keep yourself away from these kind of simplifying and renaming the existing elements, but rather think about which framework does what and how can we combine them. For this, asking this question, first of all, I think what you need is, I'm coming back to the first trend, the differentiation between outcome and output. When do we create output and how do we deliver it? And how do we decide which output to work on? And this, what is the outcome we want to create with that outcome, with that output at the end? And how do they play with each other, right? So once we are able to differentiate between these 2 levels, then it makes it maybe easier to understand which framework fits into which area. Now, another trend, unfortunately a negative trend, what I see is that we are trying to use OKR for everything. This is the oversimplifying it, saying that the framework has answer to everything, which is also not true, right? So as I said, embrace different solutions, different approaches, but know for which problem are you applying which solution, which brings me to Kinefin framework, actually. If we understand what is rather complicated and what is rather complex, in which area do we use rather one framework and for which area are we using another framework, this is a good start to categorize your frameworks you have in the hand and then apply them accordingly. What do I mean with that? Let's see. In the complex area, we are in an area where we don't know the relationship between cause and effect. It's not known. We can only find out once we experimented, worked on that, and then understand how can we move forward. On the complicated area, on the other hand, we know how the cause and effect is. So we have a solution already that we applied for hundreds time, or someone else applied it. We just need to get that experts in the room. In that case, these different approaches, of course, need different kind of ways of working, which is on the complex area, if we need to experiment, if we need to understand what outcomes are we creating with our outputs, to understand that cause and effect on the go while we are working on that, then OKR is a suitable framework for that part. On the other hand, if we are already knowing and repeating the things we already did and they are good and we just need to keep doing them, then we are in a business as usual area of work, which means that there are other frameworks that are applicable for these kind of, for the organization of this kind of work. Right? So Natalija, what's our next topic?
So the next one that we want to talk about is, if we're looking into how we work with OKRs, you know, what we use them for, what we don't use them for, a question often pops up is, so how often do we then need to do that, right? There has been this kind of trend of saying like OKRs is done on a 3-month basis, ideally on a quarterly basis. These are also, I find, most of the examples that you find in the literature and in the communities, right? What we see happening now in the last, I would say 1 or 2 years especially, is that many organizations might start with a 3-month cadence, but they move away from that and experiment with something else. And there again, coming back to your experimentation point, they tried that and it had a certain effect. And then they maybe found that, well, in our business, in our area of expertise, things change so fast that working with OKRs on a 3-month basis is not fast enough. So they might even look into a 2-month lightweight version of OKRs to really cater towards their need, that they have the flexibility around the goals and it kind of relate back to their fast changing environment. On the other hand, there might be organizations saying, well, with everything that we have in place and with the context and maybe also the size that we're looking at, for us, it might be more beneficial to look into a trimester cadence of OKRs, where we clearly define the directions that we want to move into for the next 4 months, but where we might also have a little, less heavy process in terms of all the alignment and everything else that needs to happen. That does not mean that in some teams it might not still be possible, right, to do things on a shorter cadence or to even mix it up. But that's a question and also of how much standardization do you need in the entire organization, or where can you maybe also find certain gaps and pieces where teams and departments or even parts of the organization can decide what is best for them. So the point here is really that you need to experiment and find an approach that works best for you in your environment with your organization. And just be aware that 3-month basis is not the only option, but there are others out there. Of course, what we're not saying, and that's coming back to the principles, is that, well, we have a yearly budgeting process. It would be really easy to just do 12 months OKRs. This is not what we mean, right? We still want to stick to the basic principles, but use kind of the wiggle room that you have, for example, from 2 to 4 months to create an environment that really fits your needs. When you have made that decision, a topic that often comes up when companies start to implement OKRs is, okay, if we now need OKR definitions, if we need check-ins, if we maybe need to deal with OKR tools and all the connections I just talked about, like who is doing all that, right? And this is what brings me to the discussion of what roles do you need in the OKR process? So the question that I think you need to answer if you want to start working with OKRs is who's responsible. So basically, who's got the OKR hat on? And this is not an easy question to answer because there are different perspectives that you need to take into consideration. So first, who's then responsible for the results, so the actual goal achievement? Coming back to the initial idea of OKRs, of course, that should be a team effort. But coming back to OKR architecture and what we said there, like who is then the team that is responsible? How do you define the group of people who are responsible for the actual goal achievement? On the other hand, who is then responsible or who's got the hat on for the OKR process, for building up the OKR system, for making sure that everything works, or maybe even facilitating some of the events? And who is then also responsible for creating the right environment? So coming back to the prerequisites, who is responsible that we have a strategy in place, that we actually have the capabilities in the organization to make these things work? And so the answer to these questions can be very different depending on which perspective we look at. What we see happening in organizations is that many companies start to understand that just doing OKRs, meaning let's buy a book, let's just try it out, often does not fly. So many have started to educate and build internal support and dedicated roles to support the processes. And many companies see a need to establish not just OKR coaches, so people who practically support the teams in the OKR processes, but also somebody that I would call a process owner. So someone that oversees the entirety of the topic, can also relate to the different connections of OKRs with other organizational elements, at least in the beginning, right? So somebody to basically connect all the dots that you start to open up once you start working with OKRs. The impact that has, from my point of view, is that more companies now luckily start to increase their OKR maturity. So coming back to the topics we mentioned, right, that outcome versus output OKRs is now a topic because people get more education, know more about these things, and can actively coach their teams accordingly. And so they start to actually implement the framework instead of just the headline, right? But I find it still important that you find an individual solution for responsibilities and inspect and adapt there as well. So for one company, it might be a great idea to just implement for OKR coaches, have them educated and have them guiding all the different teams. In a company your size or your structure, you might need something different. And secondly, little theoretical knowledge in my case, or in my view, is not enough to really support teams to be successful, because I find everyone who's ever tried to work with OKRs finds there's a huge gap between knowing about the idea, knowing about the concept, and actually implementing it successfully in the context that you have with all the challenges that you will face in your organization. So what are maybe some practical tips that you could take away here? First of all, ask yourself the question, do we already have clarity who's responsible for the process? So can we actually answer that question? And what kind of work with OKRs do we see in the teams? Do we see task lists as OKR? Do we see alignment processes who take forever? And is that maybe something that we want to improve? And give it a thought to think about, can maybe internal roles actually support the teams with their challenges? Do they have enough education and experience? Or do we maybe need to ramp up their game, build some more capabilities in order to make it successful for the teams, but also in order to save a lot of time and effort in an OKR process? And so I found that the foundation to really support teams in that process is a mix of, we have a shared OKR foundation, so meaning we have a common understanding of why we work with OKRs, what they mean, how they fit into the bigger context, that people have really built up competencies on a practical level on how to coach teams, but they also get a lot of practical application inside the company, maybe also through meetups or the community, and really learn about OKRs, the latest trends, for example, but also how to get more out of working with OKRs and feedback all that knowledge that they gather into the organization. Once you have started with that, maybe you have already implemented some roles, maybe you have a lot of theoretical knowledge in terms of, okay, how can we improve the system? Then often comes the question, so how do we then implement it to everyone? Of course, we already said not every team and every part of the organization needs OKRs, but sadly enough, we still see a trend of this never-ending story of Big Bang implementation. So what do we mean with that? Often, and even I see that happening in many organizations, is when they made a decision that they want to implement OKRs in our company, then the answer is often, okay, like, great, let's put together a 12-month rollout plan, let's accelerate the growth of your company in no time and be done with it, right? I think we already made our point pretty clear that this is not the way to go, and this is also not helpful for a successful OKR implementation. But what can you then do instead? From our point of view, it's really important that you use the OKR principles already to implement OKR, meaning already in the implementation, you do something differently than you did before. So coming back to these principles, you start to plan implementations in short cycles with a perspective on continuous improvement. You create a participatory change story. You are transparent about what you're doing, what you're not doing, and what the hopeful outcome is. And also there you give orientation to the people, but leave a lot of room for experimentation and learning on the go. So 2 concrete things that I would recommend doing is define OKRs for your OKR implementation. I think this is always the first good exercise to see, first of all, do we have a shared understanding of what we're trying to achieve and what we're after, but also to get into the practical application of the concept that you want to share and implement in your organization. And constantly inspect and adapt also your OKR system every cycle. So don't fall into the trap of expecting that you design your OKR system, you roll it out, and then it will just work itself. No, you need to constantly inspect and adapt that. And this is also where the OKR roles I've been just mentioning come into place, to gather that feedback again, to see what kind of iteration do we then need to make our OKR system even more successful in the next iteration. These were the 10 trends that we wanted to share with you today. Of course, there's a lot more to say about each and every one of these topics, and probably a lot of questions already popped up into your head. And this is where we want to continue in the upcoming months to deep dive into some of that topics as part of our Reshaping the Future of OKRs endeavors. So some themes that we want to dive into are the prerequisites and the principle of OKRs, where, for example, Cansel will bring in her expertise of how to combine OKRs and strategy. We want to talk about how to get started with OKRs, so dive more into the topics of how to build a great architecture, how to design roles and responsibilities. We also want to talk about how can you then actually work better with OKRs. So deep diving more into the outcome part and the business integration. And last but not least, also look at the bigger picture. So example, I will focus on organizational and team development, how to combine OKRs and HR processes, so really making it work in the bigger context. And so let's join us on our journey, right, Cansel? And how can they do that?
They can do that quite easily in a LinkedIn group. We just created a new group, Reshaping the Future of OKRs. When you take a picture of the QR code, you just come to the link and then can join the group. In the group, you will get the information about when are we going to organize the webinars, the meetups, and so on. So we are planning a great open space event again in the 3rd year. So join the group, stay tuned. There's a lot to come from our side.
Yes, and let's reshape the future of OKRs together.